recession, but actually disproportionately contributed to the shedding of jobs in the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And by definition, those industries that shed more jobs than average exacerbate busts of recession. And of course, the localised environmental and social impacts that you all no doubt know a lot about. Now, the very final point on national interest grounds that we make, and this is a really important one that's often underplayed in the Australian debate. It's often assumed that because we are so immaterial, just 1.5% of the world's emissions, that whatever we do cannot affect the global climate trajectory. What we show in this report is that Australia's sphere of influence is so great, and Australia has makes such a great contribution to the problem, and has such a great potential to contribute to the solution, that Australia's actions materially either decrease or increase the chances of avoiding climate change. And of course, that chance has a value. And we argue that it's in our national interest, even narrowly, economically, to actually to lead in order to realise that increased chance of a globally safe climate. So instead of subprime fossil fuel assets, it's this here that we should be investing in. It is the future that is in Australia's long-term national interests. Cheap renewable energy will, of course, solve some of the most challenging problems facing humanity this century, from climate change to oil scarcity to energy poverty, and allow us to build a global economy on foundations as reliable as the rising sun. And we have the power to make it happen. So in this, the critical decade on climate change, do we want to be the world's leading fossil fuel dealer, catapulting humanity towards the limits of a safe climate? Or do we want to lead the world to zero carbon prosperity? The choice is ours. Laggard or leader. Thank you.
International policy and assessing the economic and social impacts of climate change. Bradley Smith is an engineering professor at the University of Queensland, and he works at 6 Degrees, which is a branch of Friends of the Earth in Brisbane, and we also share an office. So please welcome this lovely gentleman.
Fergus for the wonderful report, and obviously to organise such a great event. I think it's really important tonight that a lot of myths were busted that really needed to be busted. Fergus talked about the myth that the UN negotiations will get us over the line and achieve the outcomes that we need, and how they've failed us for the last 20 years. I think it's a really important myth to let go of, but I'm also a little concerned about what that leaves us with. For people who have hung their hopes, I suppose, on these international negotiations, if we finally recognise after so long that they're not working, what do we have left? And really, why has it taken us so long? Why has it taken us 20 years to realise that this isn't working? And I think perhaps that's largely because what else is there? And so I'm really glad that Fergus has talked about some possible alternatives, although I think we need to perhaps flesh them out a little more about how they can really become a reality. I guess some of the other myths that I think are really important that we're busting tonight is that we're doing our bit on climate change. Clearly we're not. Fergus talked about the need to reduce our emissions sooner rather than later. Those 15 years, if we peak by 2020, it almost seems impossible to get such a steep curve in the reduction. But what that means for Australia is even more extreme. Countries like India and China have such a low per capita emissions that inevitably they'll need to continue to increase them for a while, which puts a burden on Australia, and rightly so, a country with such a high per capita emissions, to reduce our emissions right now, really urgently. And so I think it's important to realise that reality. Other than this, I think that coal mining is the powerhouse of our economy, even though it employs only less than 2% of Australians. It's really important, I think, that we realise that it's not such a huge part of our economy. That there's very few people actually employed in the coal mining industry compared to the other things like agriculture, tourism, and manufacturing. The myth that if we don't dig it, someone else will, and that's a myth I'm really tired of. And it's so great that we can say that's not the truth. That's not how it's going to work. If we don't dig it, probably no one will dig it. There's certainly no one will dig it in Australia's coal. Overwhelmingly countries, it's not just coal, right? People are transitioning rapidly to other sources of energy like solar and wind and so on. So the other options are there, and if we don't dig up the coal, then all the better for the transition to renewable energy. I want to talk about some realities as well. So I mentioned before about letting go, I guess, of that idea that the UN negotiations are achieving what we want them to achieve. And how, I suppose, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for people working in community groups? What does that mean for people who are concerned about climate change? And I think it can mean some really positive things. It can mean that the power is sort of taken out of these high-level negotiations that are undemocratic, over which we have no say, and put back in the hands of the people who really are concerned and want to make change. So I think that's a really positive thing. Hopefully we can see that there are other ways, like Fergus started to outline, that we can harness our own power, I suppose, to create the change that needs to be created. I just want to ground truth some of the things that Fergus said about Australia's sphere of influence on fossil fuels. Certainly we're the world's largest coal exporter, and like he said, the Australian government predict that we'll increase our fossil fuel exports by 50% by 2035. In Queensland, the reality is a little more extreme. At the moment, going through the government approvals process are 52 new coal mines or expansions of coal mines. And most of them are not small coal mines either. They're some of the largest coal mines we've ever had, certainly up to twice as big as any coal mine we've currently got in Queensland. So that adds up to 600 million tonnes of new coal compared to the about 109 million tonnes that we're currently producing. It's a 300% increase, and that's projects that are currently going through the approvals process that the proponents want to have happening by 2014, 2015. So this is a 300% increase this decade. It's really right here and now, and this mining boom is really extreme. If you look at the number of ports, the port expansions happening up and down the coast of Queensland, it's even more extreme. It adds up to around 940 million tonnes of coal export capacity. These numbers, 900 or 600 million tonnes, can be a little hard to come to grips with. So I suppose if we could measure them in terms of Clive Palmer's. Clive Palmer is a geologist businessman we have here in Queensland. He probably weighs in somewhere over 100 kilograms. So if we try to convert that 600 million tonnes into Clive Palmer's, it turns out to be around 7 billion Clive Palmer's. So that's around the population of the planet. 100 kilograms of coal for every man, woman, child on the planet. That's the sort of expansion, that's our annual export, the sort of expansion in our annual export we're looking at in Queensland over the next year. The other reality I want to talk about is the political reality. And Beyond Zero Emissions have done a great deal of work looking at power and electricity. But what about political power? What are the political realities here? Fergus has outlined a plan to put a moratorium on new coal and gas developments, new fossil fuel, dirty energy developments. Which government in Australia at the moment is going to do that? I mean, we know now with the LNP government that they really plan to next year are we hoping that the Abbott government will come in nationally and start to, say, well, let's turn this whole train around and put a moratorium on coal mining. So I think it's really important to come to grips with that political reality. And I think it's really difficult, but I don't think it's impossible. Fergus talked about Germany as a good example, and it really is. I like to think, if all the countries in the world just did what Germany did, we'd probably be right. We'd probably be out of this mess, right? And so, it is possible. But what are the differences? I mean, what are the differences between the vision that they're implementing in terms of supporting this transition to renewable energy and I suppose the civil society and community spirit that is underpinning that transition happening over there, compared to what we have in Australia, I suppose. And I really think that deeply it's a thing about culture, a culture of volunteerism, a culture of doing internships and having a really strong NGO sector. So I think that's something that we can learn a lesson from and perhaps start to turn these things around. I mean, we all deeply know the benefits of having that volunteer culture. Just look at the great work that Beyond Zero Emissions are doing. All these wonderful reports. So people with such passion are unlocking that passion and going ahead and doing work that's really important. So perhaps that's an idea for how we can start to move forward with something. I assume that everybody here in the audience cares deeply about these issues, about climate change and about, leaving a habitable planet for future generations. So we all care deeply, and what are we leaving tonight with? I hope that in the Q&A discussion we can talk a lot about how we can turn these wonderful visions into reality. Perhaps people would leave with a bit of despair, looking at the reality of the situation we're in. The 2 degrees limit that our governments say they're committed to is so far away from the reality of what's happening. But hopefully you'll go away with some excitement that the myths are being busted that need to be busted. These myths that have been stifling our progress towards the change we need to see. The myths that have been stemming the evolution of our society towards the hopeful society that we want to see. I think these myths of fact have been really well vetted by this report. And I'd really like to have some more discussion about how we can achieve these visions. One thing I want to add is that it's been a real pleasure for me to work over the years with passionate, excellent people in communities that are directly affected by the coal industry. People who are so concerned about their farmland that they want to protect, or the nature refuge, or the reef that they run a tourism business on. And I think there are so many good reasons to stop coal mines. And one certainty for me is that working together is one way that we can make this unachievable vision achievable. So thanks for your time, and I suppose I look forward to working with you all towards this wonderful vision that we have. And I commend the authors on taking these wonderful steps towards it.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak and respond to this report. I know we want to ensure that we have times for Q&A, so Emma, I'm going to ask you if you know more than 4 minutes to tell me when I've used 3, okay? Just let me know. Thank you. Let me start off just by adding a tiny little bit to Emma's introduction, which I think is important, and that is, I am the negotiator that Fergus referred to, and given my role in climate change issues, first as a government employee for over a decade, and now in consulting, working with everyone from coal companies through the Lowy Institute, through to the Climate Institute, and a broad range of companies, I take a somewhat different tactic that I look at these issues as much as I can with as a realist focus as possible in terms of what's possible and what's probable and why. So let me start by saying 2 things. I've got a confession and I've got a quibble. I guess I've given you a confession already, but let me tell you about the quibble I have in the report. And my quibble is actually, it seems in some ways kind of minor and insignificant, with the title, From Laggard to Leader. Because to be honest, I think